The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. There is a phase in which the body begins to decelerate before the mind agrees to notice, a quiet divergence where muscles, breath, appetite, and sleep subtly withdraw their former urgency while thought continues to sprint ahead as if nothing has changed, creating a soft internal friction that is not painful but unmistakably unfamiliar. In this phase, movement loses its automatic confidence, not because the body is broken, but because it is renegotiating its contract with speed, efficiency, and output, choosing conservation over display, while the mind still rehearses timelines, expectations, and imagined futures that no longer match the physical tempo. The sensation is often interpreted as weakness or decline only because the culture trained the mind to expect obedience from the body. Yet what actually unfolds is a reversal of authority, where the body begins to assert a slower intelligence that does not argue, does not explain, and does not accelerate to meet mental pressure. This slowing is not dramatic and does not announce itself with clear symptoms. Instead, it appears as longer recovery after simple effort, as pauses between actions that used to be chained together seamlessly, as a preference for fewer movements done with more weight, more presence, and less performative intention. The mind, still calibrated to earlier conditions, initially interprets this shift as resistance, laziness, or loss of discipline because it has not yet updated its model of reality, continuing to issue commands based on a world that rewarded speed, repetition, and constant readiness. What emerges between these two systems is not illness but lag, the same kind of delay that occurs when an operating system runs outdated instructions on new hardware, producing friction not because either side is wrong, but because synchronization has not yet occurred. During this period, the body communicates in sensations rather than arguments, using heaviness, fatigue, and reduced tolerance for overload as its language, while the mind responds with narratives, comparisons, and internal negotiations that attempt to restore the previous pace. Yet the body does not negotiate because its slowing is not a preference but an adaptation, a recalibration to conditions where constant acceleration no longer provides safety, stability, or meaning, even if the mind has not yet accepted that these conditions have changed. This is why rest begins to feel different, no longer a tool for recovery before the next push, but a state with its own gravity, one that the body enters fully while the mind remains restless, scanning for justification, permission, or explanation. In earlier phases of life, the body tolerated being treated as a vehicle, something to be fueled, maintained, and directed toward goals defined elsewhere. But in this slowing phase, it begins to behave more like terrain, something the mind must learn to move with rather than drive through. The mismatch becomes especially visible in moments of stillness, when the body settles quickly while the mind continues to simulate action, replaying conversations, future plans, and unresolved tensions, revealing that motion has shifted from the external world into the internal one. Over time, this internal motion also begins to lose momentum, not through effort or discipline, but because the body's reduced output quietly signals that not all thoughts require execution, not all impulses require response, and not all plans require completion. This is often the moment when people describe feeling older without aging, tired without being exhausted, or detached without being numb, because the familiar feedback loops between effort and reward have weakened, leaving space where automatic motivation used to operate. The body, slowing ahead of the mind, becomes a living constraint that the mind cannot bypass, forcing a confrontation with limits that are not imposed from outside, but emerge organically from within the organism itself. These limits are not rigid walls, but gradients, subtle reductions in tolerance for noise, conflict, multitasking, and emotional volatility, guiding the system toward narrower channels of engagement where energy is spent more deliberately. As this continues, the body's preferences become increasingly specific, favoring depth over breadth, rhythm over urgency, and continuity over novelty, while the mind gradually realizes that forcing variety and speed no longer produces stimulation, only strain. This realization does not arrive as insight, but as resignation, a quiet acceptance that the old methods no longer work, and that effort applied in the same way yields diminishing returns, regardless of how convincingly the mind argues otherwise. The slowing body also alters the perception of time, not by changing clocks, but by changing how long actions feel from the inside, making previously trivial tasks feel complete in themselves rather than merely preparatory steps toward something else. In this way, the body begins to anchor attention in the present without intention or technique, simply by refusing to move faster than it can fully inhabit, creating a natural resistance to fragmentation. The mind, encountering this resistance repeatedly, starts to relinquish some of its urgency, not because it has been persuaded, but because sustained urgency without corresponding physical support becomes energetically unsustainable. What replaces urgency is not calm in the emotional sense, but neutrality, a reduction in internal pressure that makes fewer things feel immediately necessary, allowing priorities to reorganize without conscious decision. This reorganization is often misread as loss of ambition, yet it is more accurately a refinement of signal, where only actions aligned with the body's available energy and tolerance remain viable, while others quietly fall away. As the body slows, it also becomes more sensitive, not in vulnerability, but in resolution, detecting misalignment faster, responding to excess sooner, and recovering more slowly from violations of its new parameters. This sensitivity teaches the mind through consequence rather than instruction, demonstrating that certain environments, conversations, and rhythms now cost more than they offer, regardless of their former value. Gradually, the mind stops trying to override these signals and begins to observe them, learning the body's new language not as a set of rules, but as a pattern that reveals itself through repetition. In this observation, a subtle trust forms, not as belief, but as familiarity, where the mind recognizes that the body's slowing is not sabotage, but guidance toward a mode of living that requires less defense and fewer compensations. This trust allows the mind to loosen its grip on constant interpretation, reducing the need to explain every sensation or justify every pause, and in doing so, thought itself begins to decelerate. The deceleration of thought does not feel like silence at first, but like fewer intersections, fewer internal conflicts competing for resolution, creating longer stretches of unremarkable presence that do not demand narration. Within these stretches, identity loses some of its urgency as roles tied to productivity, responsiveness, and availability become less activated by default, revealing how much of the self was maintained by speed rather than substance. The body's slowing thus acts as a solvent, dissolving identities that require constant motion to remain coherent, leaving behind a simpler sense of existence that does not need to be maintained moment by moment. This simplicity is not chosen and cannot be imitated because it arises from biological pacing rather than philosophical preference, making it stable in a way that deliberate minimalism often is not. As the mind continues to align with the body's tempo, it discovers that many fears were sustained by momentum alone, losing their intensity when no longer fueled by constant activity and reaction. What remains is not certainty but tolerance, an increased capacity to remain with incomplete thoughts, unresolved situations, and unanswered impulses without immediate correction. In this tolerance, the system as a whole becomes less reactive, not through suppression, but through reduced velocity, allowing stimuli to pass through without triggering automatic chains of response. The body, now clearly leading, sets a pace that favors continuity over intensity, making consistency more natural than bursts of effort followed by collapse. This pace does not produce visible transformation, which is why it often goes unnoticed, yet it fundamentally alters how reality is processed, shifting experience from accumulation toward integration. Eventually, the distinction between body and mind softens, not because they merge, but because their rhythms converge, creating a unified tempo that feels neither slow nor fast, but appropriate. At this point, the original tension is barely remembered, replaced by a quiet recognition that the body knew before the mind was ready to listen, and that its slowing was not a loss, but a necessary adjustment to conditions that no longer support perpetual acceleration. What remains is a form of presence that does not announce itself, does not demand interpretation, and does not seek validation, simply existing at a speed that allows life to be felt without being chased. If you understand this, welcome to the club.